It began on a late autumn afternoon, the kind of day when the sun no longer shone. It simply hovered behind thin clouds, like a secret too tired to reveal itself. St. Mary Mead had already quieted for the season. Gardens had gone to rest, the tea shops were half empty, and the lanes carried more mist than sound. But by dusk, the first tremor in the stillness came, not with a scream, nor a splash, but with a ripple. Young Henry Bates had been chasing his dog along the east side of Larchmere Lake when he stopped suddenly by the rotting fence near the old boathouse. The dog had begun barking at nothing in particular, and Henry, curious and more perceptive than most 11-year-olds, peered through the fog at the dark water. "Something sank," he said later to his mother. But it didn't fall. It went under slow, like it didn't want to make noise. Of course, in any other place, it would have been brushed off as a child's imagination, but not in St. Mary Mead. Not when the house by the lake, the great, gray-stoned Larchmere, had been locked for over 20 years, and certainly not when it had once belonged to the Langford family, whose sudden departure had left more silence behind than any funeral ever could. Miss Marple, who had just finished setting down her knitting and was halfway through pouring a cup of Darjeeling, heard the tale from Mrs. Bantry the next morning. They were both in line at the bakery, waiting for the morning batch of lemon scones. "Henry says he saw a ripple," Mrs. Bantry said, half scoffing, half whispering, "and not a frog's ripple either. Something deeper. I swear, Jane, I always said there was something left unsettled at Larchmere." Miss Marple didn't reply right away. She merely stirred her tea quietly later that evening, seated at her front window, her eyes drifting toward the barely visible rooftop of the estate in the distance. She recalled Celia Langford, not the gossip, but the girl, always dressed too properly for her age, with gloves in summer and a distant, distracted air. There had been rumors, of course, of a tutor who disappeared, of a family argument, of a locked cellar no one spoke of again. Later that same week, a dark green car rolled slowly past the post office and turned onto the path toward the Larchmere gate. No one had seen it arrive. No one saw it leave. But Miss Hartnell swore she caught a glimpse of a woman in the back seat, hair tied in a gray twist, face pale as rainwater. Celia Langford, older, thinner, returned. By Sunday, word had spread like steam on glass. "She's come back," Mr. Lyle muttered to the vicar. "Alone, I hear. Not a servant with her." "No one returns to that house unless they've something left unfinished," added Mrs. Weatherby at the sweet shop, "or something they're hoping to bury deeper." Miss Marple said very little, but she listened, and what she heard most clearly was what no one had said aloud, that whatever Celia had run from had never really left. She walked by Larchmere 2 days later. The iron gates were rusted but slightly ajar. Ivy had taken over the stone walls. One upstairs curtain had been drawn back, and though the front door remained closed, the bell beside it, tarnished brass, long untouched, was polished just enough to glint in the gray light. Someone was expecting something. Or someone. Miss Marple pressed her gloved fingers gently to the gatepost and paused. Then, like a ripple moving across old water, she turned and walked back into the village, quiet, thoughtful, and already noticing the small things most people miss. The knock on the door came just before noon, light, deliberate, with a rhythm that felt too polite to be urgent and too careful to be casual. Miss Marple set down her tea and opened the door to find a familiar face, now hollowed with age. "Miss Langford," she said, though the name tasted more like memory than greeting. "Celia, please," the woman said softly. "May I come in?" Miss Marple nodded and stepped aside. Celia entered like someone stepping out of a fog, her coat damp from the morning mist, eyes wide but tired, and hands curled tightly around her handbag as if it held more than belongings. They sat by the fire without ceremony. The clock ticked gently behind them. "I heard you'd returned," Miss Marple said. "I wasn't planning to stay," Celia replied, her voice steady but cold at the edges. "But the house, there's more there than I remembered, or perhaps less." Miss Marple waited. Over the years she had learned that most truths, when ready, arrive without needing to be prompted. Have you ever looked at a place and realized you knew none of it was quite how you remembered? Celia continued. her gaze fixed on the flicker of flames. The rooms are too quiet, the air heavy. I found a door I don't recall ever opening, and behind it. She hesitated. There's a room under the stairs. Not a cupboard. Something else. I found old clothes, a pair of spectacles wrapped in a silk handkerchief, and a broken music box. It plays one note. Just one. Held too long, like it's waiting for someone to finish it. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes did not leave Celia's. There was also a ledger, Celia added, in my father's study, tucked behind the panel near the fireplace. He used to write everything down, names, payments, notes. I thought it was just estate matters, until I saw one entry repeated more than any other. She paused, then whispered, Harrow. The room felt colder for a moment. Alec Harrow, Miss Marple said quietly. Your tutor. Celia nodded. He was kind to me, kinder than my family ever managed. He spoke to me as if I were a person, not a burden, not a Langford. And then he vanished. You believed he left. I was told he had, Celia said, her hands trembling now. But I found his spectacles, Miss Marple, the ones he used to clean, with that same pale handkerchief after every lesson. He never would have left without them. Miss Marple leaned back slowly in her chair. Do you believe he was harmed? Celia's eyes met hers then, tired, scared, but not unsure. I believe he never left the house at all. Outside, a wind passed low over the rooftops, scattering leaves across the lane, like whispered rumors. Inside, the fire crackled, but it did little to warm the cold that had crept into the room. Miss Marple stood and fetched her knitting bag, though she had no intention of knitting. Would you mind showing me the room? She asked. Celia blinked. Now, there are some doors, Miss Marple said gently. That shouldn't be opened alone. Celia hesitated, then nodded. And so, not long after, two figures, one in a gray shawl, the other in a navy coat, walked slowly toward the edge of the village, up the winding road where the trees leaned close and Larchmere House stood watching. It was time to go back inside. Larchmere House had the kind of silence that didn't simply linger, it pressed. The moment Miss Marple stepped through the heavy oak door, she felt it, not the quiet of an empty home, but the weighted hush of a place that remembered too much and chose to speak of none of it. Dust hung thick in the air, yet the air didn't smell stale. It smelled paused, as if life had once breathed through these walls and then, one day, simply held its breath. Celia led the way through the dim hallway, her steps measured, her eyes scanning corners as though expecting the house to shift beneath her feet. When they reached the study, her father's old room, she paused at the threshold. Miss Marple noted how her hand trembled slightly as it rested on the doorframe. It's just as he left it, Celia said quietly. No one's touched a thing since he passed. No one dared. Inside, time had stopped. A thick green curtain hung crookedly across one window. A chessboard sat mid-game, as if waiting for an opponent who'd excused himself years ago and never returned. Books lined the shelves in tidy military order, and above the hearth hung a faded portrait of a stern-faced man with sharp cheekbones and the cold, calculated eyes of a man used to having his word obeyed. Langford Sr. The ledger is behind the fireplace panel, Celia said. I only found it last week. I don't know what made me look. Miss Marple nodded and walked slowly to the hearth, her steps light and deliberate. She ran her fingers along the carved molding, then gave the wooden panel, just right of the mantel, a gentle push. It clicked open. A small cavity lay inside, revealing a brown leather-bound book, its spine cracked with age. Miss Marple slid it out with care and carried it to the desk, where the morning light now streamed faintly through the dusty curtain. She opened it. The ink had faded, but the hand was clear, precise, slanted, meticulous. Langford had written like a man who believed even secrets deserved neatness. Names, dates, amounts, some with notations like retained services or private tuition. Others were more cryptic. H. Final discussion, October 12th. S. Agreed silence, November 3rd. Payment ceased, December 1st. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. H. Must be Alec Harrow, she said aloud, tracing the entry with a fingertip. And S would be Stanhope, Celia murmured. My father's steward. He left shortly after Alec did. I barely remember him, but I do recall how suddenly he went. No farewell. Just gone. Miss Marple turned the page. There was more. References to withdrawals and cash. A note in red ink. Remove second key from cellar door. Replace with decoy. She looked up. Celia, do you know if the cellar door was ever locked? Always, she replied. My father kept a key on a chain around his neck. He said it was for wine, but I never saw anyone go down there. Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on the pages. Did your mother ever mention Alec after he disappeared? Celia's face tightened. Only once. She was halfway through a fever and kept repeating the same thing. He didn't go far. Not far. He's still with us. I thought she was hallucinating. I was 14. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, her mind already stitching threads. There were too many silences, too many people who had vanished or died under the weight of things not said. She looked at the portrait above the hearth once more and thought of a man who recorded bribes in ink and kept the truth locked under stone. But the house had begun to give up its ghosts. Celia broke the silence. Do you think he's here? Somewhere in this house. Miss Marple did not answer at first. She looked toward the floor, as if listening for something. Then she said simply, I think someone wanted us to believe he left, and they made certain no one questioned it. Outside, the wind picked up. A shutter banged softly against the siding. The ledger sat between them like a confession written too late. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked to Celia with quiet resolve. I believe it's time we looked at the cellar. The cellar at Larchmere House had never welcomed visitors. Tucked beneath the east wing and accessible only through a narrow passage off the pantry, it was known more for its shadow than its purpose. In years past, servants had spoken of its dampness, its smell. The way sound seemed to vanish once you stepped inside. But it had remained locked ever since Mr. Langford's death, and no one had thought or dared to disturb it. Until now. Celia led Miss Marple through the house with hesitant steps, a candlestick in hand despite the early hour. The electric light's faulty down there, she said, voice hushed, as if she expected the walls to hear. And I haven't been since I found the ledger. They reached the passage, and Miss Marple took a moment to study the door. It was thick oak, and bore an old brass keyhole, dulled but intact. Just beneath the frame, a faint draught whispered out, carrying with it the smell of earth, mildew, and something harder to name. Not rot exactly, more like history decaying in private. Celia retrieved a small velvet pouch from a drawer in the sideboard and removed 2 keys, both iron, both worn. One of them works, she said. I'm not sure which. Miss Marple held them up to the light. The first was smooth, uniform. The second was slightly bent at the stem, as if it had once resisted opening what it was made for. She chose the second. It fit. The lock gave with a dry snap, and the door creaked open with the reluctant groan of hinges not used in years. The steps were stone, damp and slightly mossed, winding down into a cellar colder than the season demanded. The walls dripped in places, and the air grew heavier with each descent. At the bottom, the room opened wide, a low, vaulted chamber of brick and shadow. Wine racks lined one side, though most were empty. Old boxes, coal bins, and a rusted iron stove stood like forgotten sentinels. But what caught Miss Marple's eye immediately was the far wall. Unlike the rest of the cellar, this wall had been repaired. The brickwork was cleaner, the mortar fresh, at least, fresher than the rest. A row of old paint cans had been placed deliberately in front of it, as if to draw the eye elsewhere. Miss Marple walked slowly toward it and tapped the bricks with her knuckles. Hollow. Celia stood behind her, arms folded tightly across her chest, breath shallow. He's there, isn't he? She whispered. Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Instead, she stooped and picked up a scrap of paper half stuck behind the cans. The edges were curled with moisture, but the ink was still legible. It read, If you find this, it means I failed, or someone else succeeded. Either way, the truth is here. H. A cold silence filled the cellar, the kind that didn't simply come from the air, but from realization. Celia covered her mouth. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. I should call the constable, she said, voice breaking. There's someone buried here, isn't there? Miss Marple turned to her gently. Yes, and I believe it's someone who never got the chance to leave. They returned upstairs in silence, the cellar door closing behind them, like a secret being resealed. But Miss Marple knew the truth, no longer slept beneath a stone. It had stirred. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the village settled into its ordinary hush, the wind changed direction, and with it came the faintest sound, like a note struck on an old music box. A single tone. Long waiting. The dead do not speak, Miss Marple thought. But sometimes they leave the door open just enough for someone to hear. By the following morning, Larchmere House was no longer just a forgotten silhouette at the lake's edge. It had become the center of hushed conversations, narrowed eyes, and stopped mid-sentences in shops across St. Mary Mead. News of the discovery, though no one said precisely what had been discovered, spread the way gossip always did in the village, faster than logic, but never quite outrunning suspicion. The constable, Mr. Graves, arrived just after 10, his bicycle leaning awkwardly against the fence. Miss Marple was already at Larchmere, seated at the long kitchen table, with a cup of lukewarm tea beside her. Celia paced near the hearth, like a figure trapped between two decades. The bricks were freshly laid, Miss Marple explained to the constable calmly, as though describing a rose bed, deliberately concealed. There's something, or rather someone behind them. I think we both know who. Mr. Graves removed his cap, scratched his head, and nodded with the practiced solemnity of a man used to murder but familiar with death. The inspector will need to come down from Melchester, he muttered. Could be a day. Maybe 2. That would be wise, Miss Marple said. In the meantime, I wonder if I might take a walk through the village. Graves looked at her sideways. To gather information? To remember, she replied softly. St. Mary Mead always remembers, even if it pretends not to. By early afternoon, Miss Marple was seated on a bench outside the post office, with Mrs. Bantry beside her, knitting half-forgotten in her lap. I always said it, Mrs. Bantry whispered. I always said that boy didn't just vanish. Alec Harrow. He was too good, quiet, kept things to himself, but not the sort to just run off. You knew him well. Not really, she said, but there was something in the way he looked at people, like he already knew who was lying and didn't mind it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Did he have enemies? Mrs. Bantry blinked. Oh, not enemies, no. But tension, yes. Your memory's good, Jane. You must recall the steward, Mr. Stanhope. I do. Left just weeks after Alec did. And your Mr. Langford, Celia's father, became so dreadfully stern around that time. More than usual. There were whispers about letters, money, things being settled quietly. You understand. Miss Marple did. She next visited Reverend Talcott's wife, who brought out a tattered parish ledger and several old newsletters. There's not much about Alec Harrow, she said, flipping pages. But look, here's an old Fate program. He performed a violin solo. And there's this. She passed over a clipping. It was a photograph. Grainy, but unmistakable. Alec stood on the edge of the group, violin in hand. And beside him, Mr. Langford, smiling, hand placed firmly on the young man's shoulder. Miss Marple studied the image, noting not the expressions but the distances. Alec's eyes were not on the camera. They were on someone out of frame, watching. Later that afternoon, she stopped by the bakery and encountered Miss Hartnell, who spoke with a pinched expression and the energy of someone long suspicious and finally vindicated. I told you, didn't I? Told everyone. That place, Larchmere, it was too perfect. All that polished silver, the manners, the cold stares. No house so proud doesn't have something buried underneath. Sometimes it's not the house, Miss Marple murmured. Sometimes it's the people. That evening, she returned to her cottage. A storm was rising. Clouds pressed low and restless over the village rooftops. She lit the lamp by her window and sat with her knitting, though her hands moved slower than usual. The village had indeed remembered, but what it remembered most clearly was how willingly it had once forgotten. Up at Larchmere, a lantern flickered in the second-floor window. Miss Marple watched it through the gathering dark, and thought not of murder, but of silence, of all the things Alec Harrow might have said if given the chance. Tomorrow, the inspector would arrive, and with him, questions. But tonight, Miss Marple already knew where to begin looking, because in St. Mary Mead, the dead didn't speak, but the living, sooner or later, always did. Inspector Brigham arrived just past noon the following day, all stiff collar and over-polished shoes, his expression betraying the weary certainty of a man who believed small villages contained only small truths. He had come, as he put it, to examine a decades-old curiosity, and left little room in his tone for tragedy. That was, until he descended into Larchmere's cellar and saw the sealed wall for himself. By late afternoon, the bricks had been dismantled, carefully, quietly, with no announcement to the press. Behind them lay a shallow chamber, damp, cold, and undisturbed for nearly a quarter-century. Within it, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a broken violin, and human remains that required no introduction. Miss Marple didn't join the constable or the inspector as they processed the scene. She didn't need to. She already knew what they would find. Instead, she sat in the study, eyes settled on the faded green curtains, her fingers resting gently on the spine of the old ledger. Celia, white as chalk and trembling in silence, sat across from her. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would my father do this? Alec, he wasn't a threat to anyone." "Sometimes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Truth isn't the danger. It's what people fear it will expose." The inspector returned, removing his gloves with irritation. "We'll have the coroner in by morning. Cause of death is yet to be determined, though blunt force seems likely. There was a note, Miss Marple, found wedged between the wall and the violin case." He passed it to her with reluctant deference. She unfolded it delicately. The paper was browned with age, the ink faded but legible. "I never meant for this to happen, but I could not let him speak. He knew, and once he knew, he would not keep silent. I tried to reason with him. I failed. Forgive me." It was unsigned, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she traced the curvature of the letters. Elegant, steady, familiar. Later that evening, while the police combed through the cellar and the villagers pretended not to peer from behind their curtains, Miss Marple sat once again by her window, knitting untouched in her lap. She remembered something Mrs. Bantry had said days earlier, that Mr. Stanhope, the steward, had vanished quietly and without warning. But Miss Marple had always believed people didn't vanish. They were either hidden or hiding. With that thought, she paid a visit to Reverend Talcott. "Do you recall," she asked gently, "where Stanhope went after leaving the Langford service?" Reverend Talcott frowned. "I believe he moved to Devon, took a position at a retreat, a religious one. Quite sudden, if I recall." "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "I believe he didn't go alone." The Reverend blinked. "You don't mean—" "I mean," Miss Marple replied, "I believe someone else helped seal that wall. Someone who carried the weight of another's actions, and someone whose handwriting looks very much like the note the inspector just handed me." She left without elaborating. That night, she sat by the fire, violin case now resting on the table beside her, its strings long gone, but its silence telling. Some stories do not require sound to speak. They leave their voices in objects, in doors that never creaked open again, in rooms that echo only to those who remember. And Miss Marple, above all, remembered. The dead, she thought, do not need justice to rest, but the living need truth if they are ever to breathe again. The road to Devon curled like an old memory, winding, quiet, and rarely straight. Miss Marple, seated upright in the back of the motor car, watched the hills unfold with calm eyes, and a shawl drawn close around her shoulders. She hadn't traveled this far in years, but there was something about unfinished stories that called for movement. Some truths she had learned did not come to you. You had to go to them. The retreat stood near the edge of the moor, flanked by tall hedges and silent trees. It had once been a private estate, but now bore a new name and a quiet devotion to silence. Inside, footsteps were hushed, voices low, and time seemed not to pass, but rest. She was received by a Sister Mildred, who raised her eyebrows slightly at Miss Marple's request. "Yes," she said after a pause. "We do have a Mr. Stanhope here. He's lived in the East Wing for nearly 2 decades now. Doesn't speak much. Keeps mostly to himself. But he's harmless. Lost something long ago, I think." Miss Marple nodded. "If he's willing, I'd like a word. A gentle one." The room was modest, furnished only with a writing desk, a small bookcase, and an iron bed. The man who rose to greet her was older, thinner, and grayer than she remembered, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, tired, alert beneath layers of routine and regret. "Miss Marple," he said slowly, "I wondered if you'd ever come. You remember me?" "How could I not?" He smiled faintly. "You always had the look of someone who didn't need to ask questions to know the answers." She stepped in quietly, her eyes moving over the tidy desk, the brass-handled drawer, the rosary folded carefully beside a well-worn Bible. "I won't stay long," she said. "I only came to ask if you remember Alec Harrow." Silence. "Then he was a good man. And he died inside Larchmere House," Miss Marple said gently. "Behind a wall someone sealed before winter." Stanhope closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with something deep. Remorse. Yes, but also clarity. "He didn't deserve it," he said. "None of it." Miss Marple sat down across from him. "Then tell me what happened." Stanhope looked toward the window. Outside, a bird tapped softly against the glass, as if listening too. Mr. Langford discovered Alec had formed an attachment, he said carefully. "Not just to Celia. To the truth. Alec found entries in the ledger. Money being moved, land claimed through loopholes, the kind of things people prefer left buried. He confronted Langford. I was in the study when it happened. I heard the shouting. And then," he stopped, swallowed, continued, "the blow." Miss Marple did not flinch. "I was the one who helped to move the body," Stanhope said. "He threatened me. Said I'd been complicit, though I hadn't. But he knew things about my past, things that could have cost me my name. So you helped him seal the cellar." "I did." Miss Marple looked down at her folded hands. "And the letter?" "I wrote it," Stanhope admitted. "After Langford died. I couldn't bear to keep it inside. But I didn't send it. I suppose some guilt prefers to be tucked between bricks rather than delivered." "Why confess now?" Stanhope met her eyes. "Because he still hasn't been mourned, has he?" "Not truly. And because you were the only one who ever walked through that house and noticed the way the silence bent." They sat in quiet for a while longer. Then Miss Marple stood, thanked him, and turned to leave. At the door she paused. "One more thing," she said. "What did Alec mean to Celia?" Stanhope's voice softened. "Everything. But she was a Langford, and Langfords didn't marry their tutors. Not publicly." Miss Marple stepped out into the corridor as the bell for vespers chimed softly overhead. She didn't need the law to take over. Not this time. Stanhope had already lived his sentence, and Alec Harrow, at last, had spoken, through the weight of another man's guilt. Some truths did not demand punishment, only release, and that, Miss Marple thought, was justice enough. The journey back to St. Mary Mead passed in slow silence. The clouds hung low over the hedgerows, and the trees whispered faintly in the wind like voices long held back. Miss Marple sat quietly in the car, her fingers clasped over her handbag, the air around her thick, not with shock, but with sorrow gently unfolding. It was nearly dusk when she reached Larchmere House again. The old estate stood still as ever, but not lifeless. There was movement inside now, lamplight in the windows, footsteps down the corridor, and a faint, lingering trace of piano music drifting up from the drawing room. Celia was seated at the old upright, her back straight, hands trembling just slightly as she held the final note longer than necessary. "I always hated that it ended unresolved," she said without turning. "He used to say the final key didn't matter as long as the silence after was honest." Miss Marple stepped into the room, quietly, as if not to disturb the echo. "I went to Devon," she said softly, "to see Mr. Stanhope." Celia looked over, her eyes steady, wide with restrained knowing. He's still alive? He is. Older, worn, but willing to remember what others chose to forget. Celia nodded. My father killed Alec, didn't he? Miss Marple didn't answer with words. Instead, she walked to the desk and placed the old letter down, the one found behind the wall, folded neatly now. Celia picked it up, read it once, and closed her eyes. I knew, she whispered. I always knew something was wrong, but I was a child still, and by the time I wasn't, the truth had hardened, like the dust in this house. She walked slowly to the window, looking out across the lake. The lilies were still in bloom, white, open, fragile in the fading light. I found his violin when I was 16, she said, voice barely above breath. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it meant something. I hid it in the attic, and when I left, I locked the attic door. You weren't protecting your father, Miss Marple said gently. No, Celia replied. I was protecting myself, because I couldn't bear to love someone who had murdered kindness. A long silence passed between them, the kind that is not empty but full of pain, memory, and unspoken grace. You should speak, Miss Marple said finally. To someone, to anyone. Not because the police need to hear it, but because Alec does. Celia nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had returned to Larchmere, she wept, not in despair, but in release. Later that week, a quiet memorial was held by the lake. No official announcement, no crowd, just Celia, Miss Marple, Reverend Talcott, and a weathered violin case resting on the bench beside a single white lily. Celia stood in silence, then read aloud from a sheet of paper she had written in her own hand. Some truths are too heavy for the living, but the dead do not ask for vengeance. They ask only to be seen, heard, and remembered. Alec Harrow was gentle. He taught me to listen, not just to music, but to silence. I failed him once. I will not fail him again. The wind stirred the trees. The water rippled faintly, and Miss Marple, standing off to the side, closed her eyes briefly, not in prayer, but in peace. Not all crimes required arrests. Some demanded only the quiet courage to tell the story fully, no matter how long it had been hidden. A week had passed since the quiet memorial by the lake, and the air in St. Mary Mead had begun to shift. Larchmere House no longer felt heavy with unsaid things. The silence inside it remained, but now it was the soft, natural hush of a house beginning to exhale after too many years of holding its breath. Celia had started removing the dust sheets from furniture, letting in sunlight through long-shuttered windows. The villagers, tentative at first, had begun to accept her return, not as a ghost of Larchmere's past, but as its living steward. Yet something in Miss Marple's mind remained unsettled, a single thread left dangling in a story otherwise neatly bound. She returned to Larchmere late, one morning with a tin of shortbread and her usual gentle smile. Celia met her at the door, less pale now, her hair tied back, a smudge of dust across her cheek from cleaning the stairwell. "You're early," Celia said, smiling faintly. "I was just about to sort through my father's desk drawers. There's something satisfying about knowing the things that once controlled your life can now be folded away like old letters." Miss Marple followed her to the study, the room where it had all begun, and in many ways, where it had all ended. The desk was wide and heavy, carved oak, and the drawers were deep. Most of them contained what one might expect: pens, dried ink, yellowed ledgers, brittle correspondence. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the wall behind the desk, where the large family portrait of Reginald Langford had once hung. It was gone. "I took it down," Celia said. "Couldn't bear to look at it any longer." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple murmured. She stepped closer to the empty space, where the painting had been. "Did you notice this?" she asked, tapping gently at the wooden panel behind where the frame had rested. A hollow knock. Celia frowned. "A panel? I never knew." "Many old houses have such things," Miss Marple said, already easing her fingers beneath the edge. With a soft click, the panel gave way, revealing a shallow compartment no more than 3 inches deep. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and string, lay a single item. A portrait. Miss Marple lifted it out slowly, revealing a painting not of Reginald Langford, but of a woman, elegant, somber-eyed, with soft dark curls and a familiar set to her mouth. Celia's breath caught. "That's my mother, but younger. And that," she pointed, voice tightening, "that's Alec. In the background, barely visible, but look, his profile." Indeed, he had been painted into the far left corner, eyes turned toward the woman, not quite touching her, but close. The painting had been hidden, protected, or perhaps preserved. Miss Marple turned it over. On the back, scrawled in faded pencil, M.L. and H, for the days they did not speak aloud. Celia sat down slowly, staring at the painting as though it were a letter from someone long dead. "They loved each other," she whispered. "My mother and Alec. And I never knew." Miss Marple sat beside her. "It seems your father did, and perhaps that was the truth he could never bear." They sat in silence for a while, the portrait between them like a final confession. "I always thought Alec loved me," Celia said quietly, "but perhaps there was something gentler. Perhaps I reminded him of her." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Love, Miss Langford, wears many faces, and sometimes its deepest form is not possession, but preservation." Celia touched the corner of the canvas, her fingertips tracing her mother's painted cheek. "I think," she said slowly, "this is what the house has been waiting for. Not revenge, not punishment, just truth." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, then let it hang in the blue drawing room, not to haunt, but to remember. As she stepped out into the garden, the air smelled sweeter. The ivy on the walls looked less like a noose and more like a veil, drawn back at last. One final secret had bloomed, and with it, the house could breathe again. The final days of October came with a softness that felt almost like grace. The wind lost its bite, the leaves brightened into burnished gold, and the village of St. Mary Mead, for all its murmurs and memories, grew quiet again, but not empty, never empty. At Larchmere House, the front gates no longer creaked when opened, and the windows no longer stared blankly into nothing. Curtains had been drawn back. The garden was slowly being revived, and from time to time, Celia Langford was seen walking among the hedges with a purpose that no longer looked like penance. The portrait of her mother, Marian Langford, now hung in the blue drawing room above the piano. Beneath it, in a small brass frame, was a black and white photograph of Alec Harrow, violin in hand, caught in mid-smile. No plaque, no explanation, just remembrance. Miss Marple stood before both one quiet afternoon. The sun filtered through the lace curtains, dust dancing like ghosts with nothing left to haunt. She touched the piano gently. A single note hummed under her fingers. "It's strange," Celia said from behind her, "how everything looks the same, and yet nothing is." Miss Marple turned. "Because it has been seen, and once the truth is seen, nothing ever quite returns to silence." Celia smiled, faint but genuine. "I've decided not to sell the house." "A wise decision." "I don't know," she said, "but I want to live again. Not as it was, but as it should have been." That evening, a gathering was held. Not a funeral, not a wake, but something smaller, truer. A few from the village, Mrs. Bantry, the vicar, even young Henry Bates, who had first noticed the ripple on the water, were invited to share tea and stories. They spoke not only of Alec, but of music, kindness, and the things people do to hide pain, and the braver things they do when they face it. Inspector Brigham did not attend, though he sent a letter, formal, respectful, and quietly relieved that no further action was required. Mr. Stanhope remained in Devon, where his days were now spent in simple prayer and long walks through heather. Miss Marple sat near the window, sipping her tea, listening not to the voices around her, but to the silence between them. It was no longer a silence of fear or shame. It was a silence of peace. After the guests had left, Celia walked Miss Marple to the garden gate. The moon hung low, the lake behind them calm as glass. "I can never thank you enough," Celia said. "You already have," Miss Marple replied. "You remembered." They stood a moment longer. "There's something else," Celia said, hesitating. "The last page in Alec's letter. The one you didn't show to the inspector. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Miss Marple nodded. Not by name. But it said, tell her she was never forgotten. Tell her the silence was not absence. Celia's voice faltered. He meant her, didn't he? My mother. I believe he meant both of you. Miss Marple said gently. You and she both deserve to hear it. The two women stood quietly under the stars. Then, with a nod and a lingering look, Miss Marple turned and began her walk back toward the village. As she passed the lake, a faint breeze stirred the lilies, and the water shimmered faintly beneath the moon. No more ripples, no more echoes from locked doors. Only stillness, the kind that comes not from what is hidden, but from what has finally been understood. And Miss Marple, with her knitting bag in hand and the weight of unspoken stories gently lifted from her shoulders, walked home with the certainty that not all endings are sorrowful. Some are simply the truth, finally told.